Just sign it, Claire. You don't deserve a share after everything we've done for you. Dad pushes the contract toward me. Sign it, Mom says. I look up. Or what? Dad's voice turns cold. Or we're done. My name is Savannah Brooks, and I'm 34 years old. I know what you're thinking. A family business dispute. A messy boardroom moment. Some dramatic dinner table fight that gets resolved with tears and a group hug. That's not what this is. Not even close. I've spent nearly a decade working in operations for my family's regional construction supply company. Not as a figurehead, not as someone's assistant. As the person who actually kept the wheels turning. I fixed broken supplier contracts when the numbers stopped adding up. I rebuilt shipping systems that were bleeding us money. I stayed on calls until 11 at night when a distribution partner threatened to pull out 2 days before a major delivery window. When profit margins started dipping, I was the one sitting at the kitchen table with spreadsheets and a cold cup of coffee, finding the leak and patching it. My older brother, Ryan, was the face of the company. He gave the speeches. He shook the hands. He got his photo on the company's regional newsletter 3 years running. He smiled at clients and made promises, and then I was the one who made sure those promises didn't collapse under the weight of bad logistics and inflated vendor quotes. Growing up, I was told I was too emotional for leadership, too soft. My parents said it gently at first, the way people do when they think they're helping you. You're better in a support role, sweetheart. Ryan's a natural leader. The clients respond to him. I heard those things so many times that for a while I started to believe them. So I did what I always did when I felt small. I worked harder. I skipped 3 vacations in a row. I took calls on weekends. I solved problems before anyone upstairs even knew they existed. I built systems that saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I never once asked for a press release about it. When my grandfather passed, he left a will that divided his stake in the company equally. Each grandchild received 25%. My parents weren't happy. They believed Ryan should control the majority. They believed the shares should flow toward him naturally, eventually, like water finding a drain. But Grandpa had other ideas. He saw what I saw. He saw what I did, and he made sure the documents reflected that. I wasn't rich. I drove a practical car and lived in a modest condo with off-brand furniture and a plant I kept forgetting to water. I didn't need luxury. I needed stability. I needed to know that the years I had poured into that company meant something permanent and real. I had something my family never counted on: patience, documentation, and a memory for every single promise ever made. I believed loyalty would protect me. I believed hard work would earn respect. For a long time, I genuinely believed that if I just kept showing up and delivering results, they would see me. Actually see me. I was wrong. That meeting they called wasn't about restructuring the business. It wasn't about streamlining operations or preparing for an expansion phase. It was about removing me, quietly, cleanly. With a contract and a deadline and 2 parents sitting across a dining room table acting like they were doing me a favor. Sign over your share or we're done, they said. They thought fear would do the job. They thought the threat of losing my family would be enough to make me fold. They had no idea that for years, quietly and carefully, I had been preparing for exactly this moment. If you've ever been pressured to give up something you worked hard for, this story is for you. Subscribe if you know what it feels like to be underestimated in your own family. Have you ever been told you didn't deserve what you earned? Tell me below, and click hype before we continue. The meeting was held on a Tuesday evening, not at the office, at my parents' house, which already told me something. Business decisions that happen at a dinner table, in a room that smells like pot roast and old carpet, are never really business decisions. They're designed to feel personal, because personal is harder to fight. Mom had set out water glasses and a small plate of crackers, which I thought was strange. You don't put out crackers for a business restructuring. You put out crackers when you're trying to soften something. Ryan arrived after I did. He came in through the back door like he lived there, which, in many ways, he always had. He was wearing a blazer over a button-down, no tie, the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from a lifetime of being told you're the one who matters. He didn't greet me when he sat down. He just pulled out his phone, scrolled for a moment, then set it face down on the table. I noticed that. Dad slid the contract across to me before anyone had even said hello properly. It was 8 pages. I could tell from the first page that someone had spent real money on its drafting. The language was careful, almost elegant. It talked about strategic consolidation and leadership alignment and operational clarity for investor confidence. The kind of language that sounds reasonable until you read it 3 times and realize what it's actually asking for. It was asking me to transfer my 25% ownership stake to Ryan. Fully, completely. Without compensation beyond a nominal sum that was listed on page 4 in a font that was, I noticed, slightly smaller than the rest of the text. There was also a non-compete clause on page 6. 5 years. I could not work in the construction supply industry in any capacity within a 300-mile radius for 5 full years. I could not consult. I could not advise. I could not even take a procurement role at a competitor. In practical terms, it meant that if I signed this document, my entire career, everything I had built and learned and specialized in, would be frozen in place while the industry moved on without me. "We've been talking to some investors," Ryan said, and his voice had that smooth, rehearsed quality that told me he'd been practicing this. "They want clean ownership, one decision-maker at the helm. Divided shares create uncertainty." "What investors?" I asked. "Serious people," Dad said, which was not an answer. I looked at the contract again. "This doesn't offer me fair market value for my share." "It's a family transaction," Mom said. "It's not supposed to be transactional." I almost laughed. The entire document was a transaction. 8 pages of carefully drafted transaction. "You don't understand the high-level dynamics of what we're trying to build," Ryan said, and I heard the edge underneath it, the impatience. "This is about vision, about where we're going. The operational stuff you do is important, but it's not strategy. I built the operational infrastructure that generates the margins your strategy depends on," I said. Silence. The clock on the wall ticked. Mom picked up a cracker and set it back down. "That share was given to you," Dad said, slowly, "out of your grandfather's sentimentality. It was always meant to be a gesture, not a governing stake." There it was, the word, pity. He didn't say it out loud, but it was woven through every syllable. "You were given that share out of pity. Out of kindness. Out of an old man's soft feelings, not because you earned it." I kept my face still. I had practiced that too. "I need time to review this with an attorney," I said. "You have until tonight," Dad said. "Tonight. We've already informed the staff that Ryan is transitioning into sole executive leadership. The announcement was made this morning." He said it calmly, like it was already done, already real. Like my presence at this table was just a formality before the paperwork caught up. I felt something cold move through me, not panic, something quieter than that, certainty. "Why can't you just support your brother for once?" Mom said, and her voice broke a little on the last word, the way it always did when she wanted me to feel guilty for being in the room. "He's worked so hard. This family has worked so hard. Why do you always have to make things difficult?" I was going to answer. I had a response ready, measured, and even the kind I'd been preparing for a moment like this for years. But the doorbell rang. Dad frowned. Ryan checked his phone. Mom stood up, confused. The man at the door was Daniel Crane. He was the external CEO my family had hired 6 months earlier to oversee the company's planned expansion into 2 new regional markets. He was in his mid-50s, navy suit, glasses he kept pushing up his nose. The kind of man who arrived at meetings 10 minutes early and read everything twice. He had been told, apparently, that tonight's meeting was a routine governance update. He stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the contract on the table, then at my face, then at Ryan, then back at my father. "Is this what I think it is?" he asked quietly. "Just a family matter," Dad said, too quickly. Daniel picked up the first page of the contract. He read it for 30 seconds. This isn't a governance update, he said. This is an ownership transfer. It's a consolidation, Ryan said. It makes the ownership structure cleaner for the expansion. Has she agreed to this? Daniel asked, and he was looking directly at me. Not yet, I said. He pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. He set his own folder on the table, the one he'd brought for what he'd thought was a routine meeting, and he looked at the contract again. Then he looked at the non-compete clause. I'd like to review both versions of the governance documentation before this goes any further, he said. His voice was entirely neutral, which in my experience meant he was not at all neutral. Side by side, my father opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Ryan. Ryan stared at the table. The crackers sat untouched on their plate. The days after that meeting were designed to make me feel invisible. It was a systematic, deliberate kind of erasure, the kind that works slowly so that by the time you notice what's happening, you've already been half erased. I was removed from the executive email threads first. I noticed it on a Wednesday morning when I went to pull up a chain about a supplier renegotiation I had personally initiated 3 weeks earlier. It was gone from my inbox. I searched for it, refreshed, checked my filters. Nothing. I sent a message to the distribution list I had always been on, and it bounced back with an auto response that said the list had been updated. I called our office manager, a practical, no-nonsense woman named Diane who had worked for the company for 11 years. She hesitated before she answered me. I was told you're stepping away from day-to-day operations, she said carefully, that you needed some time. Who told you that? Another pause. Your brother sent an email to the team Monday morning. I hadn't been at work Monday morning. I had been at home, reviewing the contract. Within the same week, 3 of my active projects were reassigned. No conversation, no handoff meeting, no email to me explaining the change. I found out when a vendor I'd been managing for 2 years called me to ask why he was suddenly hearing from someone new. Someone who didn't know the existing terms of their agreement and had already implied those terms might be renegotiated. I thanked him for calling. I told him everything was fine. Then I sat in my car in the parking lot of a hardware store for 20 minutes and breathed. The company dinner was the worst of it, at least publicly. My father had organized a quarterly client event at a restaurant downtown, the kind of place with dim lighting and leather menus, and a private dining room in the back. I came because I was still, technically, a part owner, still, technically, employed. I sat at the far end of the table and smiled at clients I'd known for years. Halfway through the main course, my father told a joke. It was the kind of joke that lands differently depending on where you're sitting. He said, gesturing toward me with his wine glass, Savannah's always been better at paperwork than strategy. Keeps the trains running on time, though. A few clients laughed, the polite, uncertain kind of laugh people use when they're not sure if something was a compliment or a put-down. One woman caught my eye and gave me a small, tight smile that said she understood exactly what had just happened. Ryan leaned forward from his seat 3 chairs down. She's detail-oriented, he said, as if offering me a consolation prize. We need that. Vision is a different skill set, he smiled. The table moved on. I ate the rest of my meal. I didn't rush. I didn't leave early. I stayed through dessert and shook every hand at the end of the night, the same as I always had. But I filed it, all of it. The pressure at home was its own separate thing. My mother called me 4 times in 10 days. Each call followed the same arc. She would start with small talk, ask about my apartment, ask if I'd been eating properly, and then, somewhere in the middle, she'd shift. We sacrificed so much for you, she said on the 3rd call. Her voice was soft, worn. Your father gave everything to that company so you and Ryan could have a future, and now you're choosing to tear it apart. I haven't done anything, I said. Refusing is doing something. The 4th call was shorter. The expansion deal is moving fast, she said. Ryan needs this to be clean. If you're not with us on this, things are going to get complicated financially for everyone, including you. I didn't ask her to clarify. I knew what she meant, and I think she knew I knew. Ryan, for his part, had stopped calling me directly. He was operating as if the transition was already complete. He had already begun making announcements about the expansion deal, name-dropping investors, talking timelines on calls I was no longer included in. He was constructing the architecture of a new chapter and simply assuming I would disappear from the blueprint. Here is what they didn't understand about me. I had never been emotional. I had never been soft. I had been patient. Those are not the same thing. I sat at my kitchen table that week with a legal pad and 3 different colored pens, and I made a list. A very organized, very methodical list of every discrepancy I could remember, every anomaly I had noticed over the years, but let pass because I had believed in the family, believed in the company, believed that good work and loyalty would be enough. I had been wrong about that, but I had been right to document. What they didn't know was that I kept everything. I know that sounds like something people say in moments like this, a satisfying line to deliver after the fact. But I mean it in the most literal and complete way. I kept everything. It started 3 years earlier, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. I am an operations person. Operations people keep records. We track inputs and outputs. We build audit trails. We document discrepancies because discrepancies have consequences and consequences cost money. I wasn't keeping receipts to protect myself. I was keeping receipts because that is what you do when you take your job seriously. And then, slowly, over time, some of those receipts started to look different to me. The email chain I had archived from 18 months back showed revenue figures that had been reported to a potential investor at numbers I knew, because I had run those numbers myself, were inflated by roughly 30%. The email came from Ryan's account. It had been sent on a Thursday afternoon. I had been sitting 12 feet away from him when he sent it, at the desk I had occupied for 9 years, and I had not known. There were expense records, company credit card statements for quarterly periods that showed charges to vendors I could not find in any of our supplier databases, restaurants listed under equipment categories, travel charges for cities we had no operations in, not enormous sums, but consistent, patterned. The kind of thing that is easy to miss when you're looking at 100 line items and trusting the people around you. I had recordings. Not of personal conversations, nothing designed to trap or ambush. But I had attended expansion projection meetings that were formally conducted and formally recorded for internal reference. And in those recordings, there were moments where projected timelines and revenue models were stated as confirmed when I knew, because I had the actual data, that they were speculative at best and fabricated at worst. I had transferred everything to external storage, 3 backup locations, one of which was not in my home. I never intended to use any of it. That's the honest truth. I had collected these things and organized them with the same methodical care I brought to everything else, and I had filed them away and hoped I would never need to open those folders. I had a plan they never saw coming, is what I told myself during those quiet evenings in the weeks between that dining room meeting and what came next. I was not inventing a plan. I was allowing a plan that already existed, that had always existed in the structure of the evidence I held, to become ready. I had already, quietly and discreetly, made a phone call. The compliance risk that the company was sitting on was not hypothetical. It was documented. It was archived. And if the expansion deal moved forward at the pace Ryan was pushing, the scrutiny that comes with investor due diligence would find it, one way or another. Either by me presenting it first or by the due diligence process uncovering it on its own. I waited. I had learned to wait. Patience had always been my actual advantage, and this was the moment when patience was going to matter more than anything else I had ever done. I waited for the right moment. Harold Bennett had been the family attorney for 22 years. He was in his late 60s now, semi-retired. The kind of man who wore the same 3-piece suits he'd owned since 1998 and kept paper files in a filing cabinet that predated every piece of software designed to replace it. He had known me since I was 12 years old. He had watched me grow up, watched me come into the company, watched me work. He had also drafted the inheritance agreement when my grandfather passed. Every clause, every provision. He had been the one, I later learned, who had pushed back on my family's original suggestion that Ryan receive a larger percentage. He had read the old man's wishes clearly and insisted they be honored with precision. Harold called me on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after the dining room meeting. He called on his personal cell phone, not the firm's number. "I've been hearing things," he said, and he didn't need to say more than that. We met at a small office he kept downtown, separate from his main firm. It smelled like old books and dust and coffee that had been sitting in a percolator for too long. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen he kept clicking without seeming to realize he was doing it. "What they're asking you to do," he said, "constitutes coercion. If they pressured you to sign under threat of financial harm or family severance, the agreement would be unenforceable. The original inheritance structure was airtight. It was designed to be." I made sure of that myself. I told him what I had. I didn't show him everything yet. I described it. The archived emails, the expense records, the recorded meetings. He stopped clicking his pen. "How long have you had these?" he asked. "Some of them 3 years, some of them longer." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out his small window at the parking lot below. "They've already announced the leadership transition internally," he said, more to himself than to me. "Yes," I said, "and the expansion deal, moving fast." Ryan has been speaking to investors as if the ownership consolidation is already finalized. He tapped his legal pad twice. "They're overconfident," he said. "That's going to be a problem for them." Harold contacted my family indirectly. He sent a brief, precise letter to their attorney, the one they had used to draft the contract, noting that he had been made aware of the situation and that certain aspects of the transaction as structured may present legal exposure. It was not a threat. It was a precisely delivered warning shot, the kind that only someone who has been in the room for every major decision this family ever made could deliver with full credibility. My parents were rattled by it. I know this because my mother called me the same afternoon the letter was received, and her voice had a different texture than it had in weeks. Not soft. Not guilt-inducing, tight. "We should talk," she said. "I agree," I said. "Have your attorney call Harold." She was silent for a beat. "What did you do, Savannah?" "Nothing," I said. "I just stopped doing nothing." Meanwhile, Ryan continued moving forward. He sent a company-wide update about the expansion timeline. He met with the potential investors twice. He was operating from a position of absolute confidence, the kind that comes from never having seriously considered that the other person in the room might have a stronger hand. Daniel Crane, the external CEO, had not stopped thinking about what he saw at that dining room table. He had reviewed the governance documents. He had noticed, as someone who conducts due diligence professionally, that certain financial projections in the expansion materials did not align with the operational data he had been provided in his onboarding package. He hadn't said anything yet. He was the kind of man who didn't speak until he was certain. He was getting certain. The formal contract signing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning at the offices of my family's law firm. My parents had chosen the location to Project Authority. Neutral ground with their name on the guest list. They were confident. Ryan had told them she'd sign. "She has no leverage," he'd said. "She doesn't want to blow up the family." I drove to that meeting with Harold Bennett beside me in the passenger seat and a flash drive in my jacket pocket. The conference room smelled like new carpet and recycled air, the kind of environment that is designed to feel authoritative and bloodless at the same time. There was a long table with 8 chairs, a credenza with a coffee service no one was using, and 3 copies of the contract already laid out in front of one chair. The chair they had clearly designated for me. My parents sat on one side. Ryan sat next to them, jacket on, posture perfect, radiating the specific energy of someone who has already written the next chapter of their own story and is simply waiting for the current scene to finish. Their attorney was a man named Gerald Foss. He was efficient and careful, and he had clearly been briefed to keep the meeting short. He stood when I entered, nodded at Harold with the neutral courtesy of one professional acknowledging another, and gestured to the chair. I sat down. I did not look at the contract. "We're glad this could be resolved today," Gerald said. "We'll see," Harold said pleasantly. My father looked across the table at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression he used when he was trying to project patience, but was actually communicating that the patience had a hard limit. "Savannah, this is the right decision for the company and for this family. I hope you can see that. I've spent 9 years making right decisions for this company," I said. "I know what one looks like." Ryan exhaled slowly through his nose. "Let's just get through this." "Before we do," Harold said, and he opened his briefcase, "I'd like to present some additional material for the record." Gerald Foss looked at Harold with mild professional alarm. "This is a signing meeting, not a discovery proceeding." "It is," Harold agreed, "but I think the parties should have full information before anyone puts pen to paper." The door opened. Daniel Crane walked in. I had not told my family he would be there. I had simply sent him a calendar invite with the location and the words, "I think you'll want to see this." My mother's face shifted, just slightly, just around the eyes. Daniel sat at the end of the table and placed a folder in front of him without opening it. "I won't sign this contract," I said. My voice was level. I had practiced level. "Not today. Not in its current form. Not under the conditions that were used to present it to me." "You're humiliating this family," my father said, and his voice had that cold certainty it had in the dining room. The voice designed to end arguments. "No," I said, "I'm protecting myself." I looked at Harold. He nodded. The flash drive was already connected to his laptop. He turned the screen so it faced the table. The first email appeared on the screen. It was Ryan's, 18 months old, addressed to an investor contact, with revenue figures that I had run myself the prior quarter. The numbers had been increased by more than a third. Not estimated high, not optimistically rounded. Changed. Gerald Foss leaned forward. He read it twice. His expression did not change, but his pen, which had been hovering over a notepad, set itself down. The second document was the expense records. 6 quarters. The pattern of charges was laid out in a clean spreadsheet that Harold's assistant had prepared. The column on the right showed vendor names. The column next to it showed corresponding database entries. 43 line items had no match. The third item was an audio file. Harold clicked play. It was Ryan's voice, in a recorded expansion meeting from the previous spring. He was stating confirmed revenue timelines for 2 regional markets. I knew those timelines. I had been the one to assess them. They were not confirmed. They had been flagged by me as high-risk projections in a written memo I had submitted, and that, I later discovered, had never been shared with the board. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation system above us in the ceiling. Daniel Crane opened his folder. "I've had concerns about the expansion projections for the past several weeks," he said. He was not speaking to me. He was speaking to Gerald Foss. "The data I was provided during onboarding and the data underlying these materials are inconsistent in ways I can no longer attribute to normal variance." "This is," Ryan said. And his voice had lost its smoothness. "This is being taken out of context." "I'd like to table the expansion announcement," Daniel said. "Pending a full internal review." My mother pressed her fingers flat against the table. "This is a family matter," she said. "It became a company matter," Harold said, "when the company's governance was used to coerce a shareholder." "No one was coerced," my father said sharply. "You set a one-night deadline under threat of severing a family relationship," Harold said. "You informed staff of a leadership transition before any agreement was reached. The pattern of communications I have reviewed constitutes constructive coercion. If this transfer were forced through, the agreement would not hold." Ryan was staring at the table. The confidence had left his posture, the way air leaves a room when a window breaks. My parents looked at each other with the long, complicated look of people whose plan has hit a wall they didn't believe was actually there. Gerald Foss cleared his throat. "I think," he said carefully, "that we need to adjourn for the day and allow all parties to consult with their respective counsel." "Agreed," Harold said. "Savannah," my father's voice was different now, quieter. The cold authority was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like bewilderment. Like he genuinely could not understand how we had arrived at this table with the positions reversed. "You're choosing this over your family." I looked at him directly. I had thought about what I would say in this moment for years, without knowing I was thinking about it. It came out clearly, without anger, without performance. "You said if I didn't sign, I wasn't your daughter," I said. "I guess I'm finally free." I stood up, picked up my bag, and walked out of that conference room with Harold Bennett a half-step behind me, through the quiet lobby, through the glass front door, and out into the cold morning air. I kept my shares. That part was not dramatic. There was no court battle, no screaming confrontation, no final moment of theatrical vindication. There was an audit and a series of very quiet, very expensive conversations between attorneys, and at the end of it, my 25% ownership stake remained exactly where my grandfather had placed it. The expansion deal was suspended pending the findings of an internal financial review. The investor conversations stopped. The timeline Ryan had been announcing publicly was walked back without explanation in a company-wide email that thanked everyone for their patience during a period of strategic reassessment. I negotiated a structured role transition on my own terms. I moved out of operations and into an oversight capacity that reflected what I had actually been doing for years, with a title that finally said so. It was not a victory lap. I didn't want a victory lap. The relationship with my parents is fractured in the way that things fracture when the truth finally gets said out loud. We talk occasionally. The calls are short and careful, like walking through a room where something was recently broken and no one has fully cleaned it up yet. My mother sent me a birthday card in October. She didn't write much in it, but she sent it. I won't pretend the grief isn't real. It is. There is something that aches when you understand that the people who were supposed to be in your corner were instead the ones building the box to put you in. That grief doesn't disappear because you won. It just lives alongside the relief and the steadiness and the quiet, firm knowledge that you did the right thing. I chose peace over approval. It took me 34 years to understand that those two things were not the same thing and never had been. Sometimes losing their control is how you finally win your freedom. I know that now not because someone told me, but because I lived my way through the proof of it. I walked away from that law firm on a Wednesday morning with my shares intact, my career in my own hands, and no signature on a document I should never have been asked to sign. I walked steadily. I walked with my head up. I walked like someone who finally knew exactly where she stood. If your family ever tried to guilt you into signing away money, property, or something you rightfully earned, you know how heavy that pressure feels. Share your story in the comments. I read everyone. Subscribe if you believe standing your ground matters. You're not selfish for protecting yourself. Click hype to help this story reach others who need it. Your story has power. If you felt a connection to mine, please subscribe and share your journey in the comments. Every hype you give this video helps empower someone else who feels trapped or silenced. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, you're allowed to choose dignity over approval.